The boot room was dead. Kenny Dalglish burned out. Now what was there for Liverpool? The Premier League was sneaking up on them, Europe was back, and they needed to be in the mix to receive all the heightened riches, fame and glory that came with it. Instead, it was a decade to forget in terms of trophy. In terms of entertainment value, well, it was spicy, to say the least. This is Anfield Spice and Liverpool in the 90s. Kenny Dalglish's departure left a gaping hole at Anfield. I know we said the boot room was over, but it was a brief reprisal in the latter days of the 1990-91 season via Ronnie Moran. The former player and coach stepped into the breach for what was supposed to be a few games, and it turned out to be a few months. It started bad and went worse from there. Luton Town ran riot against a porous Liverpool in the club's first game post-Dalglish, before the title was effectively sealed on March the 3rd when Arsenal took another 3 points away from Anfield. But Liverpool needed a miracle even with a solid foundation. Arsenal lost just one game that season, and that was only because Tony Adams was being held at Her Majesty's pleasure in prison. Meanwhile, Liverpool fell to 2 further defeats in May and finished 7 points behind the Gunners. Ronnie Moran was never going to get the job full time, but there was one other vestige of the boot room remaining in Roy Evans. Yet it was the likes of Phil Thompson at 4-1 and Alan Hansen at 5-1 who were the bookies' favourites, until another former Red was announced, Graham Souness. At the time it seemed perfect. After all, Graham Souness had had some real-life head coaching experience, unlike the aforementioned names. He turned around an enormous ship up north when he got Rangers going in the direction of silverware. A retrospective quote from the new manager told you everything about the job ahead of him at Anfield when he said, "The Liverpool of 1991 was a pale shadow of the club I had left in 1984. This was a Liverpool still suffering from the after effects of the Hillsborough disaster, and what Souness received was an ageing team that had been neglected in terms of its reinforcements. Perhaps because Souness was in the successful teams of the late 70s and early 80s, he felt as though he needed to remedy Liverpool's ills immediately, instead of applying a drop of patience and accepting his lot. Ultimately, he tried to change too much too soon. Instantly out were the likes of Peter Beardsley, Steve McMahon, Steve Staunton and Ray Houghton, and in to replace them Mark Wright, Dean Saunders and Mark Walters. His new training regime had players injured left, right and centre, and there were even rumours that he had the hollowed boot room physically demolished. Whilst the room itself was no more, Souness wasn't behind it. The club needed a proper press room, and that room fit the bill. Either way, it was another landmark of enormous change in such a short space of time. Liverpool weren't doing great on the pitch. Souness was absent for patches due to heart surgery, and when he returned to the touchline, he faced a swell of discontent. During his recovery phase, he had taken an interview with a newspaper, and that newspaper decided to publish it on the 3rd anniversary of the Hillsborough disaster, amidst Liverpool's run to the FA Cup final. Now that would be fine had it not been the newspaper that will correctly remain vilified on Merseyside for eternity. OK, Souness got some silverware on the board via a 2-0 win over Sunderland at Wembley, but they were also limp in their European return, losing to Genoa in the UEFA Cup quarter-final, and had suffered humiliation in the League Cup away to lowly Peterborough United. Their league form remained wretched as Liverpool placed 6th, a place that Liverpool hadn't been since their first season back in the top division in 1963. Souness attempted, in vain, to get fans back on side by promoting Roy Evans as assistant manager, but after winning just 2 of their first 10 matches in the brand new Premier League, it was clear this was going to be another one of those seasons. Liverpool finished 6th again, but never mind the position, they were only 10 points off the relegation zone. They were also massively hopeless in all cup competitions, losing to Spartak Moscow in the Cup Winners' Cup and to teams like Bolton and Crystal Palace in the domestic cups. That summer, Souness returned from the transfer market with fresh additions, except these additions were of the calibre of Nigel Clough, Julian Dix and Neil Ruddock. The straw that finally broke the camel's back was another early exit in the FA Cup, again in the 3rd round, this time to Bristol City. 5 weeks after suffering elimination from the League Cup at the hands of Wimbledon and with no Europe to play for, the Reds' campaign was over before February had chance to turn up. While Souness had given debuts to the talent of Steve McManaman and Robbie Fowler from the academy, he was also seen to be completely inept at scoping out good signings for the club. And when your form on the pitch can't make up for that misgiving, your time at a club like Liverpool will only be short. For the second time in 3 years, Liverpool were looking for a new manager midway through a season, so they returned to the comfort of the boot room, only with added spice. In 1974, it was clear that Roy Evans wasn't going to make it at the upper echelons of the game. When that was obvious, and Evans made it known that he never wanted to leave Liverpool, he hurried himself into a staff position. The club announced, "We have not made an appointment for today, but for the future. Roy Evans will be our manager." And it only took 20 years for that statement to become true. And yet he was still relatively fresh-faced, aged only 45. Questions about his ruthlessness were masked with happiness from supporters who were glad to have him finally installed as manager. Playing to the masses, Evans retrieved the old training manuals and returned the club to the boot room style. He inherited a football team where had lost 7 from their first 26 league matches and sat 5th with nothing to play for. It would get worse before it got better, as Evans presided over 9 defeats from the final 16 matches. Liverpool had finished in their lowest position since relegation in 1954. There were reasons to be optimistic, however. Steve McManaman, Jamie Redknapp and Robbie Fowler were exciting players for the future to build your team around, and Roy Evans was keen to entrust other young players such as David James ahead of Bruce Grobbelaar. Evans built his team from the back, signing Phil Babb and John Scales. They weren't the only changes. John Barnes was moved into a central role, allowing him to dictate the pace of play, and it made the most of his experience and composure. That one move helped stabilise the team. Going forward, Steve McManaman was revitalised in a free role given to him by the new manager. He was as creative as ever, but now more reliable and better in front of goal. They were both asked to shoulder the burden of playing in most Liverpool games, as was Robbie Fowler, who was increasingly unable to be ignored, netting 31 goals in all competitions. The first came in an opening day obliteration of Crystal Palace, before the quickest ever Premier League hat-trick against Arsenal of all teams 8 days later. It was never going to be that serene, as the 100% record fell in September and losses were incurred at Old Trafford and Ewood Park, the 2 title favourites. However, in the latter contest against Blackburn, Liverpool arguably outplayed Rovers and in losing 3-2 had no shame in defeat. Carry on like that and Liverpool could well be contenders. Whilst they wouldn't find success in the FA Cup, losing in the quarter-final to Tottenham after 3 needless replays in prior rounds, they had already booked themselves in for a Wembley return via the League Cup. They returned to Ewood to dispatch of Blackburn and also saw off Arsenal in the run that required Robbie Fowler goals in both semi-final legs against Crystal Palace. It was the long and short of Liverpool's season after a disastrous December where they failed to win 5 on the bounce. It bounced them out of the title race for good, back into 5th. 4 of those matches were draws, but whilst Liverpool were now hard to beat, set up in a new 3-5-2 formation, they were finding it difficult to get over the line, as seen in goalless draws to the likes of West Ham, Crystal Palace, Chelsea, Everton, Spurs and Wimbledon. They'd go from holding their own against Manchester United and Arsenal to throwing away contests in front of the Kop against Coventry and Ipswich. The consistency was not there at all, and it made second-tier Bolton Wanderers a bit of a banana skin in the League Cup final that April. Bolton were 24 months out from becoming a Premier League outfit, but proved a strong test for Roy Evans' side. Yet it was the elusive Steve McManaman with the brace that ended Liverpool's 3-year wait for a trophy, and it also meant the return of Europe and a potential springboard to better things. And why not now? Liverpool struck whilst the iron was hot, acquiring Bolton's Jason McAteer, who had impressed them at Wembley, and the in-form Stan Collymore, who had banged in 22 goals for a Nottingham Forest side that finished above Liverpool the prior season. After finishing 4th and 15 points off the Blackburn pace, there was considerable ground to be made up. But if there was a season to make up that ground, it was this one. Manchester United had sold key players and opted for a reliance on their class of '92 graduates, whilst Blackburn had a quote-unquote promotion for Kenny Dalglish to Director of Football. Liverpool were optimistic, so too Newcastle United, who had snapped up Les Ferdinand and David Ginola. A month into the campaign, a marker was laid down with a 3-0 pumping of the champions Blackburn. 2 weeks later was the trip to Old Trafford in what was Eric Cantona's grandiose return to football. Liverpool put in another good shift, almost upsetting the big day after United salvaged a point late on from the spot. At almost the exact midpoint of the 90s, it was the perfect encapsulation of the entire decade. Life in England was looking up again, Euro 96 right around the corner, world-class music once again, and the nation's two biggest teams both had an exciting crop of young players. Liverpool were said to be ominously threatening again, whilst United had their comfort of Cantona back again. A month later, Liverpool went up to St James's Park and outplayed the so-called entertainers, only to return to Merseyside with nothing thanks to a late David James error. It spurred on a run of 2 points from an available 15, which took Liverpool into the festive period depressed. Before 1996 could pitch up, Liverpool had already reversed that particular tide, taking out both Manchester United and Arsenal at Anfield. Further big victories would come in front of the Kop when Forest and Leeds travelled up. Suddenly, Liverpool were back into the groove and were wrestling towards an FA Cup final against Manchester United, whilst maintaining their unbeaten run in the league all the way until March. A disappointing 1-0 loss fed into an all-or-nothing clash with Newcastle United at Anfield on April the 3rd. Liverpool had to win to stand any chance in the title race, although it was widely accepted that they were the third, much smaller horse in that race. What we got at the business end of the season was the greatest Premier League match of all time. Was it clumsy? Was it, from 2024 eyes, tactically naive? Who cares? It was entertaining as fuck. And the Collymore closing in, the Keegan draping over the Horden in the dugout, that's football. But ultimately, this was during a period of about 8 weeks where Manchester United were quietly reeling in Newcastle with a slew of 1-0 victories. 7 to be exact, with 4 winners coming at the hands of Eric Cantona. Whilst Liverpool and Newcastle were busy being entertaining, United were busy being winners. And it was just so typical that Liverpool had threatened to edge themselves back into the title race by beating the league leaders, only to lose away at Coventry 3 days later. The Premier League title was quickly forgotten about. There was just one thing on their minds now. They'd gone out of the League Cup and the UEFA Cup thanks to timid 1-0 losses in front of their own fans at home to Newcastle and in Europe to Brøndby. It was supposed to be the match of the season, the 1996 FA Cup final, but Liverpool lost a piss-poor game, typically 1-0, thanks to a late Eric Cantona volley. The match was almost a chance to collect yourself for 90 minutes after the shock of what the Liverpool players chose to wear for their pre-match Wembley stroll. Just look at them. Fucking hell. Thankfully, this attire gives us something to talk about. David James has since dismissed the criticism of the infamous suit, saying it was not white, it was cream, maybe almond. Whatever shade, they look like cunts, and obviously he's going to defend them, they were his idea. Opposition David May noted their sartorial differences. They were in their Armani suits and ours were from Burton's, before he said they looked like quote-unquote fucking knobs. Alex Ferguson is said to have remarked 1-0 as a score prediction when he saw them wearing those suits. Obviously it's an absolutely fantastic soundbite after the final is won, but had it been Liverpool lifting the trophy, that story doesn't see the light of day. Cast your minds back to the mid-2000s when them pink Nike Mercurial boots first came out. The pessimists always say you best play well if you're wearing them. But after wearing those white, cream almond, whatever the fuck suits, you best not just play well, but fucking win doing so. Unbelievably, after all that, Liverpool went on a bit of an open-top bus tour afterwards and got met with backlash. One banner reading, "Fuck off, yous lot are a disgrace." So the one thing Liverpool could claim to have won that season was Robbie Fowler's second PFA Young Player of the Year award. Scant consolation. Liverpool's blushes had only just diminished by the time the 1996-97 season was due to kick off and the Reds began from a point of weakness. Newcastle had signed Euro 96 top goalscorer Alan Shearer. Manchester United's class of 92 was maturing by the second, and even teams like Middlesbrough and Chelsea were turning over exciting players. Meanwhile, Arsenal delivered Arsene Wenger to the Premier League. Liverpool's response was Patrick Berger, and Patrick Berger, who would be routinely misused as a forward by Roy Evans. Whilst the much-needed return of Stig Inge Bjorneby was welcomed down the left, from the off you just knew this was going to be another one of those bullshit seasons when Fabrizio Ravanelli scored a hat-trick at the Riverside and Liverpool enveloped themselves into a rollercoaster of a 3-3 draw. If that wasn't enough, Liverpool appeared blunt before Sunderland in a goalless draw at Anfield later that week. But the Reds shook those early performances to lead the league at the start of October. Patrick Berger had even won Player of the Month for September, just in time for the visit of Old Trafford. United had won the FA Cup, but Liverpool had won the war by taking more England players to Euro 96, and Steve McManaman got into the team of the tournament. But have a wild guess what happened when club football came back around. Yep, United won 1-0, admittedly in a match that Robbie Fowler would deem daylight robbery. Dropped points continued to sting as 1996 ended with a whimper as Liverpool went down to both Blackburn and Sheffield Wednesday and were held at home in the derby. Stan Collymore was no longer recreating his Forest form, and his refusal to move from Nottingham was beginning to rub people up the wrong way. Meanwhile, Fowler was carrying the load for them both, netting his 100th club goal inside just 165 matches. Also, drop points from title contenders would be the norm throughout this season, leading to the lowest record points tally. Even despite 3 losses before Christmas, Liverpool had more than a good shout of winning title number 19. They were even made favourites for the title as they struck 4 goals beyond both Leeds and Newcastle as the business end of the season pitched up on Anfield's doorstep. Again, they were left with nothing much else to play for after going out of the domestic cups away to Chelsea and Middlesbrough. But they were still in Europe and had a Cup Winners' Cup semi-final against Paris Saint-Germain to play in. 4 days after confirming that tie, Liverpool went to Highbury and won. The title race was blown wide open, with champions Manchester United leading the pack and the 3 of Liverpool, Arsenal and Kenny Dalglish's Newcastle huddled close by. Then Liverpool predictably reinserted themselves into an utter mess. 4 days out from a trip to Paris and trying to juggle more than one responsibility at the same time, Liverpool dropped everything all at once. Coventry pitched up at Anfield and claimed 3 points, and the Reds surrendered their place in Europe with a 3-goal defeat in France. If the title race wasn't dead and buried with that limp result, by the time the Parisians turned up at Anfield for the second leg, it was. Liverpool had bounced back as well, winning up at Sunderland and claiming a point from a tricky Merseyside derby. They then had Manchester United to come at home, and only a win would do to keep them in the conversation. That win would put Liverpool temporarily top by a point, having played a game more than United. Had they won, who knows, it may have put a spot of pressure on. In the end, United breezed past Liverpool thanks to 2 Gary Pallister goals. Pallister, a player that Liverpool had tried to purchase back in the late 1980s. 5 days later, a grandstand finish wasn't enough against PSG, and on a 2-0 victory, Liverpool were out of Europe again. There was one shining beacon of hope though, and that was that UEFA had expanded the Champions League to 24 teams, and were now allowing 2 outfits from England to participate. Liverpool simply needed a win at Sheffield Wednesday on the final day. Obviously, they chucked that chance in, a 1-1 draw taking them to 4th in a 2-horse race. It never got so good again for Roy Evans. Despite acquiring Paul Ince and promoting wonder kid Michael Owen to the senior ranks, Liverpool was stifled by Evans' reversion to the 4-4-2. Even though they finished a place higher in 3rd, they were definitely on the outside of what was seemingly a 1-horse title race featuring Manchester United. Liverpool led Arsenal as late as March 1998, but the difference was Arsenal had 3 games in hand and dropped just 6 points between Christmas and winning the title. Meanwhile, Liverpool won 7 of their remaining 18 matches. Rumours of Kenny Dalglish's return as director of football were rife in the summer of 1998, where Michael Owen shot to superstardom in France. Liverpool were changing alright, they had to. It had been another 3 years since they had won anything and a whopping 8 since they had won the league. Michael Owen was at the top of his game. He would be joined soon by Jamie Carragher and Steven Gerrard, while Steve McManaman, Robbie Fowler and Jamie Redknapp all remained at the club. However, in the respect of the latter three, they'd already outlived their uses. McManaman's contract was coming up in 1999 and he'd leave on a free, whilst injuries to the latter two had prematurely already ended their peak years. Oh, and Liverpool were trialling this new thing called I'm going to completely fuck my club up by appointing joint managers who didn't know one another. The transition of power from Roy Evans to Gerard Houllier was blatantly obvious, and by November, Evans predictably resigned. For an era that couldn't quite promise the rampant success of the previous generation but could deliver in entertainment by the bucket load, this was a bit of a wet fart of a way to end things. The Spice Boys, that's what they called them, but it only really came into footballing vernacular in March 1997, and whilst Liverpool have been retrospectively tarred with that brush, it had been used to describe both United and Liverpool. The difference was United didn't wear those suits and kept winning those trophies. Liverpool could never be so Teflon. In his book Greatest Games, Jamie Carragher went to lengths to describe the Spice Boys team as the one with the most natural ability. From Fowler and McManaman to the likes of himself, Gerrard and Owen coming through, they should have been more than just mere contenders. Blame can be attributed to so many things. These players came through at the wrong time and possibly under the wrong manager. Players such as Robbie Fowler and Michael Owen were prematurely ruined by injury. Players like Steve McManaman prematurely left the club thanks to more successful clubs taking an interest. And simply put, the phrase that would define this team, win or lose, they hit the booze. Liverpool had a brilliant academy. They won the FA Youth Cup in 1996, which isn't mentioned nearly as much as the United class of 4 years prior, but produced some great footballers. They were backed in the transfer market too, but whilst Manchester United and Arsenal were busy signing players like Cantona, Solskjaer, Vieira, Liverpool brought in players like Vegard Hegem and Bjorn Tore Kavame. The difference between Liverpool and those clubs that would actually rule the Premier League was the mentality, professionalism and flexibility. Ferguson instilled a better mentality in Manchester United. Arsene Wenger delivered model professionalism to Arsenal before United were flexible enough to adapt to a changing Premier League world. Meanwhile, Liverpool stood still and watched it all. This was a football team that could win beautifully against the best teams in the country, but lose explosively to some of the worst clubs in their league. A team with talent in spades, but drained of a solid mentality. Stan Collymore, probably one of those most guilty, said, "We were like a bunch of kids really, a bunch of talented kids who got away with murder." Ultimately, Liverpool tried, but that isn't enough. They tried to bring a tactical ingenuity to the club, turning its back on the dogmatic 4-4-2, which delivered 4 top 4 finishes and a League Cup. For a team of a lesser calibre, we'd rave about them. For a team of Liverpool's standing close, just wasn't close enough. If you missed our film on Liverpool under Kenny Dalglish, click on this guy here and you'll see what a successful Liverpool football club actually looks like.